Okay, this is Advanced Patient Care Theory 2, Unit 6, Part 5, Burn Trauma. The recording seems to be working now, so we'll see how this goes. So I'll talk about burn sort of broadly, and then we'll talk about burn assessment and burn management. So we'll talk about smoke inhalation, sources of burns, products of combustion, a little on pathophysiology, measuring body surface area, burns and burn abuse, child abuse patterns is covered as a self-directed learning module, and patient assessment, and then burn management in the field. Smoke inhalation is the most common cause of death in fires, and thermal is the most common source, and smoke inhalation accounts for over 70% of fire-related deaths. What I always find amazing is how complacent people are when it comes to fires. I remember once my wife and I were in the movie theater, and the fire alarm went off, and no one seemed disturbed by it in the slightest bit. And then the movie shut off, and the fire alarm was still going off, and everyone still sat in the theater while we got up and left the theater. And then a short while later, everyone else cleared the theater. But this is how people die, right? As they become complacent and they ignore fire alarms, and then they get trapped and end up dying from carbon monoxide inhalation. So CO is the most common chemical of combustion, and we also see cyanide and other chemicals as well. And CO has an affinity for hemoglobin that's about 200 to 300 times greater than that of oxygen. So it binds competitively with oxygen. So in terms of history, what we want to try to ascertain, apart from the basic clinical findings and managing patients based on how they present clinically, we want to try to find out the length of exposure, whether they were in an enclosed space or not. So some signs of CO poisoning: at carboxyhemoglobins of 20 to 30%, we see headache, throbbing in the temples. 30 to 40% altered mental status, nausea, vomiting, and 40 to 50% tachypnea, tachycardia, severe headache, collapse, and 50 to 60% carboxyhemoglobin, we see coma and seizures. Generally speaking, carboxyhemoglobins greater than 25% are an indication for hyperbaric therapy. Now I know Simcoe carries CO detectors, not oximeters, but devices for measuring CO. Anyone else here work for a service that carries CO detectors? And I don't mean atmospheric CO, I mean patient CO levels. That's a no, then I assume. Okay. Some services, the supervisors carry them. These are a little bit expensive. In Simcoe, they use it's a combination oxygen and CO detector. So in terms of treatment for smoke inhalation, we want a management with hyperoxygenation, so supplemental to high FiO2s, like non-rebreather mask at 12 to 15 liters, for at least 30 minutes. And if you're treating with oxygen, they should be transported to hospital, especially since we don't know what their carboxyhemoglobin levels are like. Ventilation would be on a PRN basis, obviously. And there's a problem with pulse oximetry. Why is there limited value to pulse oximetry? Anybody? Feel free to jump on the mic. CO's got a greater affinity, but that doesn't really tell us why pulse oximetry is a limited value. Yeah, why does it provide inaccurate readings? Why does a pulse oximetry provide inaccurate readings specifically? Perfect, Roger, thanks. Yeah, so the pulse oximeter can't distinguish between oxyhemoglobin and carboxyhemoglobin. It sees O2 and CO bound to hemoglobin in exactly the same way. So, so you get a patient with CO2 inhalation or smoke inhalation, their pulse oximetry reading may be 100%. It's funny how, we know this, you and I know this, but how we forget. I was at a call for a fire last summer. It was a garage fire, and this guy had these antique cars, and he put the fire out himself and had probably a pretty significant smoke inhalation. He had a headache and was nauseated, and my partner put the pulse oximeter on. I said, let's get some oxygen on him, and my partner said, his saturation's 100%. And I said, yeah, but he's got CO poisoning. And he said, oh, right. So it's amazing how we tend to forget. And this is a guy who's got like 40 years on the job, right? So in terms of sources of burns, and these stats are not important, don't memorize these stats, but flames account for 33%, scalds 30%. These are taken from the University of Toronto a few years ago, by the way. Contacts about 15%, flash would be 10%, oops. Electrical 5%, friction 1%, radiation 1%. So in terms of patho, so within moments of a burn or heat exposure, there's a histamine release that causes capillaries to dilate and leak plasma that's lost and seeps into the interstitial space. And skin layers rapidly coagulate. When I think of coagulation, I always think about frying up an egg and how the egg is like a gel and then becomes like a hardened protein. So there's continued damage as the tissues release other mediators of inflammation like leukotrienes and prostaglandins, oxygen-free radicals that damage the cells. And histamine can lead to systemic increase in vasodilation and capillary permeability. And this results ultimately in volume depletion and poor tissue perfusion. But one of the things that's important to remember, that if you're dealing with a patient, say, who's got a 40% body surface area burn, if they're hypotensive, within the first 2 hours of the burn, it's far less likely that they're hypotensive because of third spacing of fluids. They're much more likely to be hypovolemic because they've got trauma as well, and they've got bleeding internally. So at that point, a vicious circle begins in terms of, there's volume depletion, hypoperfusion, and that leads to further tissue damage. So the other thing that happens in confined spaces is not only is there carbon monoxide, which is rapidly debilitating for people, and at some point very quickly they lose their ability to make critical decisions to escape, but the oxygen content is diminished as well. So what people often don't understand about fires is that they may think they've got lots of time to escape, but once you start inhaling smoke and CO, your mental status rapidly becomes altered, and it may be impossible to escape. They say get down to ground level, put a wet sheet over your face if you can do that, or try to filter the air that you're breathing, but better to get out of a room long before smoke starts than to linger there kind of cavalierly. Now, if any of you have lived in an apartment building, you know what it's like when an alarm goes off. Nobody wants to leave their apartment. I certainly didn't when I lived in an apartment building, but how often do fire alarms go off, and is it really worth the risk of staying inside the place? I don't know, that's a judgment you have to make, I suppose. So oxygen concentrations can drop from 21% to 50%, and that can cause fatigue and loss of consciousness. Kind of the critical level, the threshold level of CO for poisoning is about 4,000 parts per million, and fire department can come and measure those levels. But most of us, I think most services now carry an ambient CO detector on one of their kits. Do they carry those in Toronto? No, eh? Okay. That's surprising, because there was an issue in Hamilton where a crew was overcome by CO levels in this house, and they didn't even know that there was a CO issue in the house. They just knew that there was a sick family member. Yeah. And ever since then, a lot of services started carrying CO detectors, just a little device that sort of clips onto your bag, and it's quite helpful. I find even in we have a Niedermeyer whatever they call it, Niedermeyer system for the exhaust with our vehicles. But when the CO levels reach a certain point, those alarms start to go off on the bags in the back of the ambulance. So there are lots of different products of combustion. Cyanide is one of them. And this is why some services and supervisors carry a cyanide antidote kit. So cyanide is produced by the combustion of things like nylon, wool, polyurethane, urea, formaldehyde, and hydrogen chloride is produced by the burning of plastics, and this is very toxic, very irritating to the lungs. And acrolein is another common toxic product of combustion. Freon gas, you rarely, if ever, see freon gas, and I'm not even sure why I mentioned it in these slides anymore, but freon gas existed in old refrigerators. And I guess, if you go to a house with an older couple, they may have an old beer fridge or something that has freon in it, and freon was destroying the ozone layer, and it's the one time when the entire planet came together to recognize the scientific consensus that freon was a problem with the ozone, and we eliminated all freon using refrigerators and other devices that use freon, including air conditioning and car air conditioning systems. But the thing about freon is it can lead to latent death. So patients come out of the fire feeling fine, and then a day or two later die. Polyvinyl chloride is a stuff of plastics, and when it's burned, it produces hydrogen chloride, which is more toxic than CO and very damaging to the lungs, as I mentioned. So a small concentration of hydrogen chloride and ammonia can cause significant irritation to the respiratory system and the eyes, and impede the victim's ability to escape. And so even without contagious burns, it's important to consider smoke inhalation and toxicity from the products of combustion. Someone's got an open mic. I don't know if you were looking to say something or what, but right. All right. So why is SpO2 a limited value in the victim of smoke inhalation? We already talked about this. So it doesn't have the ability to distinguish between oxyhemoglobin and carboxyhemoglobin. And again, hypovolemia immediately following a burn will eliminate distal pulses needed for SpO2, and cyanide interferes with SpO2 reading as well, apparently. Someone's got an open mic. I think it's Matt. Matt, were you going to say something?
Oh no, I was just fiddling around with my stuff here. Sorry.
Okay. So what's the benefit of monitoring end-tidal CO2 in a patient who's been in the fire? Well, it may show some early signs of bronchospasm. And do you remember what kind of waveform the end-tidal CO2 takes on with bronchospasm?
Shark fin?
Yeah, shark fin. Good. So end-tidal CO2 is a good indicator of perfusion, and may also be a direct indicator of cyanide poisoning. talk about water burns. So a water burn. So bathtub sinks. This is when parents turned off the hot water or turned off the cold. Accounts for about 32% of scalding burns. Splashed accounts for about 21%. Scalded while stepping into or being put into a bathtub accounts for about 12%. Hot tap about 10%. Climbed into or fell into a bathtub or sink about 9.6%. We see this with the elderly sometimes. Just out of curiosity, has anyone had an elderly patient who's burned themselves in the tub? I had one who had second-degree burns from the tub. Anybody? So here are some temperature guides. Now, when you buy a new house, if you haven't already bought a new house, or you have bought a new house and you haven't looked at the water temperature, oftentimes the water temperature is set to as high as 60 degrees or 56 degrees Celsius, and the time it takes for a third-degree burn is really, really short in these temperature ranges. Even at 56 degrees Celsius can take as little as 15 seconds, which you might be able to get out of a hot water in a tub in that time period, but you'll probably end up with second-degree burns at the very least. So 51 degrees takes about 3 minutes. 48 degrees takes about 5 minutes, and about 37 degrees is a safe temperature for a bath. It's pretty warm when you think about it. So hot water ideally in a house should be set to no higher than 48 degrees Celsius. Hot tubs are usually kept below 44 degrees Celsius. Electrical burns. So we want to try to determine the voltage and the mechanism of injury, and the depth and extent of the burn is unseen in electrical burns. So it's important to think about body surface area when it comes to electrical burns. So what I mean by that is, if you've got electrical burn where you have an entrance wound from the electricity and an exit wound, but the body surface area covered isn't more than 4 or 5%, just remember that a lot of the burn is internal. So you might want to add 10-15% to that body surface area burn when you think about fluid resuscitation. So it's got to be adjusted accordingly, and electrical burns can happen when coming into contact with electrical outlets or high tension wires. What kind of current do we get out of electrical outlets? AC or DC? AC, good. Sorry, just activated Siri on my phone with that question. So AC poses a risk for ventricular fibrillation. Look for entrance and large exit wounds with high tension wires. We don't see that with outlets in people's homes, but and again, I think Matt, you've got an open mic and it's making noise.
Okay.
And are you able to mute your mic?
Yeah, I'm gonna try here now. My mouse isn't working, so that's what I'm having issues with.
Yeah, I think you can just mute it with this program, if I'm not mistaken, or with the headset sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Important to treat electrical incidents seriously, even when the patient says that they feel fine. I'll give you an example. An ACP student of mine years ago was telling me about a call they did for a lady who they had some sort of short in their house. They knew it because they were getting shocks from things. They thought maybe at first it was just the dry air, and they walk around and touch something and get zapped. But at one point she went to open the refrigerator and the microwave at about the same time, and she got a shock that was so intense that she actually tore the handle off the refrigerator. That's quite a bit of force. And when the crew got there, when my students got there, she felt perfectly fine. And so they did an assessment on her, and they did an ECG and everything else, and they had some difficulty, but they persuaded her to go to the hospital to get checked out. Well, one of the things that happens with electricity is that it superheats the blood and the muscles. It follows the path of least resistance. It can cause heating of the blood and coagulation. And they kept her overnight, and she had two problems. One, she started to clot, so they had to anticoagulate her. And at one point, early in the evening, she went into cardiac arrest, and they got her back with just CPR. So it was a good thing that they managed to persuade her to go to the hospital, and she was kept overnight. Apparently, she did just fine after that. They checked up on her a day later, and they were surprised to see she was still in the hospital. And that's when they learned that she had a cardiac arrest event and had some clotting issues. But remarkable that all this had happened just from what she thought was a not so serious event. So burn injuries have been likened to crush injuries in the sense that when you superheat the muscle, skeletal muscle, it can become damaged and resulting in the release of potassium and myoglobin. And myoglobin can clog the nephrons. So that's what the blanks are all about here. So damaged muscle is called rhabdomyolysis, and damaged muscle cells release myoglobin and potassium, and that leads to clogging of the nephrons, which leads to renal failure, and the potassium can lead to dysrhythmias. I'm not going to go through the action potential with the cell, but just remember that potassium is an issue. And when you get hyperkalemia, you get alteration of the action potential. So with hyperkalemia, you get the action potential that sort of goes like this instead, and the repolarization, this sort of lettering is not very let me see if I can change the color of this. No, I can't quite figure it out. Let's try this. Oh, that might have worked. Yeah, so there we go. So with hyperkalemia, you get alteration of the action potential, and repolarization becomes prolonged, and ultimately that can result in flattening of the P waves, widening of the QRS, slowing of the heart rate, and ultimately cardiac arrest. So lightning strikes are interesting in the sense that, well, for a couple of reasons. One, it's rare that someone is struck directly by lightning. If they're struck directly by lightning, they're likely going to be in cardiac arrest, and nothing you can do is going to get them out of cardiac arrest. But most often, lightning strikes nearby, and there's a flashover, and a couple of things happen. There's flashover burns, and sometimes you'll see their clothes burnt off, or just their clothes in tatters. Because it's direct current, DC current, it may result in asystole, and they may have a return to spontaneous circulation without any intervention, but then they sometimes rearrest because they have chest wall tetany from the electrical current, and so they have a secondary respiratory arrest and followed by a cardiac arrest again. And in a multi-casualty incident, reverse triage principles apply when it comes to lightning strikes. That means that if they're alive, just leave them alone, but if they're VSA, we're going to try to resuscitate them. Because sometimes just even CPR is enough to get them back. Those who are alive are going to stay alive, and as I mentioned, flash burns are common. So it's interesting, back in the early days when we first had electricity, there was a competition between direct current and alternating current, and ultimately alternating current won out, and partly because alternating current is easy to store, it travels well to homes from great distances, and but when the linesmen, and I say linesmen because they were all men, were putting up electrical lines, some of them were getting electrocuted and dying, and they approached, I'm trying to think of the name of the John Hopkins University to see if they had any ideas about what can be done for these people to keep them safe. And so John Hopkins University did some research on this, and they suggested some safety measures. But what they also did was they caused cardiac arrest in animals using AC current. And they found that if you gave a counter shock with direct current, it would get those animals out of ventricular fibrillation or out of pulsus VT. So back in those days, they called defibrillation a counter shock with DC current, which is what we still do to this day, right? We defibrillate using DC current. So if you see in the literature the term counter shock, that's where it comes from, is the early days of electricity in homes. So when it comes to chemical burns, our own personal safety comes first, and that means decontamination of these people. So when we're responding to an industrial site, workplace hazards, material systems, or witness information should be readily available, and staff can usually provide those MSDS sheets that'll describe whatever first aid is needed, but for the most part it's decontamination. We'll talk about that in a separate talk. Any questions so far?